Puppy keeps following cop for help. When he realizes why, he bursts into tears. Maple Ridge looked harmless at twilight, the kind of small town that swallows secrets without chewing. Officer Michael Harper rolled to a stop beside the tree line, meaning to stretch, the ache behind his eyes nagging when a sound slipped out of the woods. Thin, needled, wrong. He killed the engine. Wind skimmed the hood. The whimper came again, a thread pulled taut. A puppy stepped into the orange wash of his headlights, shivering. Mud on its paws. One ear notched like a torn stamp. It stared as if it knew him. Then it clamped teeth into his pant cuff and tugged with frantic purpose before flicking its gaze toward the dark. "Easy," Harper whispered, but his voice felt loud in the hush. Gravel cracked under his boots as he crouched. The puppy's ribs fluttered under rough fur. Its breath came in fast, white puffs. It tugged again, a knot of muscle and fear, then trotted a few steps, looked back, trotted farther. Not a stray looking for food. "A messenger," Harper's radio muttered static. He reached for it, then stopped. The woods held their breath like a room waiting for bad news. Sap and damp earth, a metallic tang he couldn't place. Leaves whispered. Somewhere deeper, something shifted with the weight of a human exhale, or the wish of one. Training said, log it, call animal control, keep driving. Instinct, older than orders, said follow. The puppy yipped once, sharp as a snapped wire, and vanished between black trunks. He stepped after it, beam cutting a narrow tunnel through bramble and shadow. The temperature dropped. The ground gave under his heel as if hollow. Ahead, the puppy froze, eyes reflecting coins of light, then pointed its muzzle at the dark. "Show me," Harper said. What the dark answered with, "We'll shock you tonight." Michael Harper's days ran on rails no one could see, and Maple Ridge adored those rails. He rose before sunrise, brewed coffee so strong it stung, checked the night logs, tightened laces, and drove the same looping circuit past the diner's chrome window, the feed store's faded sign, and the little library that smelled of dust and hope. He nodded to faces he'd known for years without ever really knowing, kept distance folded neatly behind a courteous voice, and returned each evening to an apartment that held only the noises he allowed. The hum of the fridge, the click of a lamp, the quiet flip of a page he rarely finished. He told himself that steadiness meant safety, that the town's small concerns fit the size of his capacity to care, that a man could be useful without being open. Still, on certain nights, detachment felt less like armor and more like glass. The puppy unsettled that balance the first time, when it tugged his pant leg and led him a dozen steps into the trees before fear sent it skittering back. Tonight, that same insistence returned with a sharper edge, as if whatever had waited in the dark had grown tired of waiting. At sunset, the town slipped into its evening costume, Main Street thinning to a ribbon of headlights that vanished into the hills. Harper finished a pass by the trailhead and meant to keep rolling when a sound touched the edge of hearing, a short, fine thread of urgency. Then out from the brush stepped the puppy from last night, smaller than he remembered yet full of focus, ribs faint, fur roughened by burrs, eyes bright in the low light. It made a crisp, demanding bark, looked into the trees, then back at him with a stare that felt strangely formal, as if asking for a decision, not a snack. He eased from the car and kept his hands open where the dog could see them. The dog took 3 quick steps toward the trees, returned to tap his boot with a wet nose, then looked again into the dark with an insistence that narrowed the world to a line of motion. Harper considered the checklist most officers follow on quiet nights. Call it in, leave food, mark the location for morning. Routine had always rewarded patience and paperwork. Instinct argued that routine sometimes arrives too late. He clicked on his flashlight, radioed his location with the dry shorthand of habit, and followed the dog onto the path. The ground turned from gravel to packed dirt, then to needles that made his steps whisper instead of crunch. The beam cut a tunnel that caught webs and floating seed husks, each line and fleck flashing, then vanishing as if shy. What little light remained above the canopy pooled like thin water and slipped away. The dog traveled with a discipline that argued against hunger alone. It trotted ahead, paused at bends, checked on him, and resumed, correcting course by inches with tiny nose flicks. When he slowed, it voiced a soft, urgent sound that pulled him forward. Harper measured his breathing, paced his steps, and took stock of every detail the beam revealed. A faint scrape appeared on the bark of a young maple, fresh enough to shine. He logged it without drawing conclusions and moved on. Questions gathered and refused to settle. Lost owner? Abandoned campsite? A trap set by thoughtless hands? The little guide did not wander, did not sniff for food wrappers or familiar scents, did not try to climb into his arms. It moved with purpose that exceeded appetite. He told himself to stay skeptical, to avoid filling blanks with dramatic answers, yet a pull he could not name kept knitting itself into his stride. Whatever he had kept walled off out of practicality leaned toward the opening like a listener cupping an ear. The canopy thickened until the last spill of sunset became a dim wash the flashlight could not cancel. His radio muttered distant chatter. He lowered the volume and let the forest's grammar take precedence. The dog halted at a narrow wooden footbridge, paws splayed, head up, tail steady. Water beneath chimed over stone in a rhythm that matched his steps. He crossed and climbed a short rise. Branches brushed his sleeves. He lifted the light and found a snag of blue fabric on a thorn. He folded it and pocketed it, not because it proved anything, but because it asked questions with the smell of damp and ash. The dog's energy ratcheted up, tiny chest heaving, pupils wide. It dashed forward and returned, unwilling to go far without him. The path bent left where two huge trunks leaned toward each other and made a rough arch. He breathed through his nose and caught damp stone, crushed fern, and something faint that could have been smoke long dispersed. A low gust moved overhead and stirred a whisper that slid through needles like sand poured slowly from a hand. He listened for voices, engines, metal on metal. Nothing. He stopped to reassess and found his thoughts returning to the life waiting back in town, to the apartment that put no demands on him, to the calendar that never held more than hearings, patrols, and maintenance. Now, a creature barely old enough to understand danger was insisting he walk into it. He checked his watch, checked his radio, and told himself he would stop at the first sign the situation tilted beyond prudence. Though he knew the promise meant less, with each footfall he added to the distance from the lot. The ground tilted downward into a narrow gully. Stones rolled under his heel and clicked down the slope. He planted carefully and used his offhand to steady against trunks. He shone the beam across the gully floor and found drag lines that crossed and blurred, too messy to decode yet too deliberate to ignore. The dog stood over them, looked up, and gave a small sound that had more command than plea. It turned and threaded through a gap in bramble so tight that he had to angle his shoulders to get through. Beyond the squeeze, the air cooled a few degrees. He pictured calling for backup. He pictured the conversation about why he had followed a dog this far after dark. He weighed embarrassment against urgency and found that urgency carried more weight than pride. The forest pressed tighter. He stepped where the trail permitted and kept his feet under him through slick sections. A spider filament crossed his cheek, and he wiped it away, focusing on the small guide whose outline slid between shadow and light like a purposeful spark. He kept the pace purposeful without rushing, a compromise between caution and the tug that would not let go. Somewhere, a branch creaked under its own age and settled, the kind of sound that makes a listener think of footsteps and then admit the mind's talent for theater. He let the thought pass and watched the dog thread shadow like a seamstress pulling bright thread through dark cloth. Ahead, the trail lifted over a hummock and dipped into brush that smelled of resin and rain left from an earlier squall. Twilight seeped into everything, blurring edges while sharpening attention. A paradox he recognized from late shifts when streets emptied and every small detail felt loud. He tasted metal on his breath and could not say whether it came from the air, the beam's batteries warming, or the steady leak of adrenaline. The dog paused at a snag of roots, tested a root, and sprang over, landing with a tiny huff, then waited as if counting him in. Michael swept the light low and invited his muscles to memorize this terrain, because returning quickly might matter. Noise from town no longer reached here. The place might as well have been an island under the spell of early night. He felt the habit of detachment push once more, urging a retreat to policy and a phone call, and then felt it lose traction against a simpler obligation. When a creature asks for help with this kind of clarity, you go. He had spent years learning how to separate pain from procedure, yet he had never managed to switch off the part that answered when need called in plain terms. He stepped around another tangle of brush, lifted the beam again, and let the dog set the next turn. Twigs ticked his boots. Needles cushioned the fall of each step. A soft, almost human sound swam through the hush and vanished before he could fix it, like a face glimpsed in moving water. He stopped, listened, and moved on, because halting felt like asking the forest to close over whatever waited ahead. The dog's posture tightened. Its tail drew straight, its head angled, its body pointing with the steady certainty that comes from purpose rather than training. Michael nodded without meaning to, the private acknowledgement one gives a colleague who has made a point. A low bank of clouds slid across what remained of the day, draining more color from the scene, and the beam took over completely, a narrow fact moving through a field of suggestion. He kept his offhand ready to clear branches and his primary hand free to steady or lift as needed. Moisture beaded on fern tips and broke under the brush of his pant leg, cooling his calves. Somewhere water moved underground. He felt rather than heard it, the faintest pressure at the edge of attention. The path turned again, and the dog looked back with solemn concentration, then advanced with the gravity of a courier sworn to deliver the message regardless of hour. All the while, Michael checked his own reactions, measuring them against experience and the basic truth that uncertainty can either freeze a person or hone them. Tonight it honed him. He tightened his grip on the light and followed, letting the steady urgency define the night's narrow path. Michael pushed deeper where the trail dissolved to a faint crease, the puppy sliding ahead in quick bursts, then pausing to check on him, eyes bright coins in the beam. The canopy sealed the last of the evening, and the air cooled into a damp that settled inside his jacket. His boots found the rhythm of packed earth and root while smaller claws stitched counterpoint. Every few yards, the dog lifted its muzzle toward the dark as if tugged by an invisible string. He let habit manage the basics, light angle, footing, bearings, while another part of him listened for meaning beneath noise. Leaves rasped, needles whispered, fog threaded the low ground in pale skeins. No houses now, no road mutter, only the hush of old trees holding their breath. The dog's focus did not waver. It trotted, halted, stared, urged, a messenger compressed to muscle and will. He thought of turning back and felt the idea shrink, flimsy as tissue. The forest refused open answers. It offered fragments instead. On a stump, he found a scrape fresh enough to shine, sap damp and sweet. He angled the beam and stored the detail without conclusion. The cold deepened. Somewhere water trickled through stone. An owl offered one syllable and then kept its counsel. The puppy pressed its shoulder against his boot, then moved on, paws whispering. He kept his breath even, pace measured, attention tuned to the narrow lane the light permitted. He knew the safe version of this night and knew he had stepped beyond it. People who have followed a quiet tug without proof will recognize the sensation. If you have ever trusted a hunch and walked forward anyway, you understand why he did not call it off. The ground lifted, dipped, and folded into a shallow gully. He skirted the rim, noting faint drag lines blurred by leaves. The sight unsettled him, not because it proved anything, but because it suggested struggle. The puppy lowered its body and moved faster, ears pricked, tail straight. His radio whispered static and then fell mute, a reminder that distance now measured more than miles. He pushed through a gate of leaning trunks, the beam catching threads of web like hair in lamplight. The smell shifted toward damp fur and old ash, a combination that raised the small hairs along his arms. On the other side, the path narrowed to a corridor of young firs. Dew shook loose when the dog brushed past, cold dots striking his pants. He cut the beam for a count of 5 to reset his senses and discovered that darkness had its own clarity. In that clarity, he heard it, faint and pained, not the puppy, not wind, a breath caught and bent by effort. He held still until the sound faded, then lifted the light and moved again, slower now, deliberate as a surgeon's hand. The puppy trembled at the shoulders, not from cold alone, but from urgency. It did not whine for comfort. It pointed the way, small body translating need into direction. Michael let procedure fall back a step and allowed instinct to pace him. He cleared a slick log, ducked under a branch that sketched his cap, and paused at a snag of twine trapped in bramble. He pocketed it, filing it with the scrape and the drag marks, tiny entries in a ledger he would decipher later. The silence thickened until each footfall sounded irresponsible. He softened his knees, loosened his shoulders, projected calm the way he would for shaken witnesses. The beams shone on a patch of ground where leaves lay scuffed in arcs, as if something had kicked against the earth and then fallen still. The pained sound returned, sawed thin by exhaustion, and traveled along the ground as if the soil carried it. The puppy answered with a near-silent whine and held position, eyes fixed. He felt unease tighten into a clean line behind his ribs. Whatever waited ahead was alive and hurting. He advanced with care, counting steps, pausing between to listen. Moisture collected on the lens. He wiped it with a thumb and kept going. The forest smell shifted again, earth laced with iron. He tasted metal and could not tell if it came from the air or his own adrenaline. Past a shallow pool that reflected the beam like dull glass, the ground rose toward a low ridge. The dog climbed, then waited at the crest, profile stark in white light. Michael joined it and leveled the beam into the dip beyond, finding bracken, snapped sticks, and a shallow depression where weight had pressed the leaves flat. Another breath reached him, ragged, clipped, stubborn. He felt the old discipline settle. Slow hands, soft voice, open stance. He said he was here, that it was okay to hold on, that help had found the path. The dog did not look at him now. It stared into the dip, vibrating with contained sound. He stepped down the slope and felt mud pull at his heels. The beam skated over a tangle of fallen limbs that made a crude lattice. He crouched, angling the light under, and saw only dark, then a glint that might have been wet hair, then dark again. He rose and shifted right to look from a different angle. The pained sound crawled out again, barely there, like a note played on a cracked reed. He spoke once more, voice low, even, meant to reassure whoever listened. No answer beyond breath. The dog edged forward, placed a paw on his boot, and waited as if asking permission to lead a final stretch. He nodded without realizing he had moved. They advanced together through brush that clutched at his legs, every twig seeming to test his resolve. He kept his hands where any frightened creature could see them, palms angled away from threats. The beam drifted over pale bark, then a smear of mud on a stone, then the curve of vines holding damp leaves. He listened for human voices and found none. He listened for engines and heard only water buried in rock. The cold tunneled deeper, making his fingers clumsy. He flexed them around the flashlight to keep feeling. He stepped on a branch that snapped too loudly in the hush, and the puppy flinched but held its ground. They reached a notch between two rooted mounds. From that notch, the sound came again, closer now, resolving into a string of short, strained breaths that ended in a thread of pain. He imagined, against caution, a dozen explanations and rejected them one by one, leaving only the fact of distress. The dog leaned forward until it nearly toppled, then steadied, refusing to rush and scare whatever lay ahead. He mirrored that restraint. Deliberate pacing mattered. Panic would risk harm. Every nerve in him insisted on speed. The discipline he trusted insisted on control. He let control win. A shape loomed to the left, just beyond the index of his beam, and receded when he tried to fix it. Branches ticked against each other like thin bones. He tasted sap and wet bark and the dull ache of held breath. The ground underfoot shifted from loam to a firmer layer, as if root and stone braided beneath. He weighed calling for backup and decided the minute he needed to explain this exact route would be a minute he could not afford. He would radio when he had eyes on the source. Not a moment sooner. The puppy flicked an ear, inhaled, and stepped into a thicket so tight he had to push vines aside with his forearm. They emerged into a small clearing no bigger than a living room, the ceiling of branches so low he could have touched it. At the far edge, something moved with the stubbornness of survival. He stopped in place, lifted the beam just enough to see by without blinding, and waited for his eyes to gather detail out of the layered dark. The sound repeated, fragile but adamant. The puppy's body trembled, not in fear, but in fierce certainty. Michael felt the pull that had started at the trailhead settle into undeniable purpose. He took one more step and kept the truth at bay for one more breath, because anticipation held the moment between danger and mercy with a grip that made time slow. He paused at the clearing's edge and listened, letting the night settle until it stopped feeling personal. Frosty air slid into his lungs and burned, sharpening his focus. The dog flicked its gaze between him and the shape, begging him to understand faster. He swept the beam in short, careful arcs, not to blast the source with light. A limb creaked and a pine cone dropped, impacts hopping into silence. The breath ahead hitched and recovered, stubborn as a heartbeat. He set his feet, steadied his hands, and fully committed to another step. If you have ever kept going when fear suggested retreat, you know the measure of this next footfall, the way doubt surrenders to duty. Michael steadied himself at the clearing's lip and lifted the flashlight until its beam sliced a bright lane through bracken and slick bark. A weak whimper threaded the dark again, thinner than before, and the puppy whipped into frantic loops around his boots, claws scuffing wet soil, then dashed to the thicket and bounced back as if tugged by a cord. He hushed it on reflex, yet the cry kept leaking through the hush in short, desperate pulses that made patience feel like cruelty. He moved anyway in careful inches, shoulders rounded to slip between branches, lamp cutting a tunnel that revealed crushed fern, drifted needles, and a set of damp prints no larger than a thumb. Cold bit his lungs. Breath fogged and broke against his collar. Muscles buzzed from holding the light steady. The dog circled faster, yapping in bursts, then planted its paws against his shin and shoved, small body vibrating with purpose. The whimper wavered again, ending in a rasp that sounded like it hurt to make. Michael set his boots on firmer ground and forced calm to sit on top of fear. Branches scraped like wire dragged over canvas. The beam swept low and caught a tangle of rotted limbs and vines. It trembled, stilled, trembled again. Training tried to impose order, assess, contact, contain. Yet something older argued that pain speaks in a language older than protocols. The puppy flung itself at the tangle and skittered sideways, barking and circling, pausing to watch his face as if asking why he was not already down on his knees. His pulse hammered. A cramp crawled up his forearm. He swapped grips and edged closer. The beam found the dull wet of matted hair beneath sticks. He crouched until one knee pressed cold loam and angled the light to avoid blinding. The mound shifted and the cry unraveled into a hoarse breath from deeper under the lattice. His heart kicked hard. This was no ordinary stray situation, but a crisis wrapped in wood, cold, and dwindling breath. The dog answered with a sharp, high bark that sounded like a protest and a plea combined. He tamped down the urge to rip branches clear without thought. One wrong pull could crush what he meant to save. He scanned for snares, traps, and wire, and found only wood, vine, and neglect. The forest seemed to listen, not hostile, only watchful, while a small life tried to hold on. He braced a hand on a trunk and slid right to find an angle through the weave. In a narrow seam, something quivered with the rhythm of stubborn breath. The puppy planted its paws against his shin again, then spun and yapped at the thicket, then faced him, insistence distilled to bone. "I know," he said, unsure whether he meant it for the dog or the life inside the tangle. Strain announced itself everywhere, calves twitching on the slope, knuckles stiff with cold, back complaining about the crouch he could not abandon. Still he held because haste equals harm. The cry dwindled until he had to lean forward to hear it. "Stay with me," he said, and meant it for his own steadiness, too. The dog shoved its nose into the gap, jerked back, sneezing sap, then fixed him with a look that felt like an order. He tucked the light under his arm long enough to pull on his gloves, slid the beam back to the seam, and probed with his free hand. Twigs rattled, vine bit. Something inside flinched, and the breath thinned to a thread. "Easy," he said, shaping calm across each syllable. Instinct is not magic. It is memory acting as a compass. If you have ever stepped forward without proof because retreat felt wrong, you know the pull anchoring his next move. Ask yourself what powered that step. The answer looks like this puppy, paws raw, body shaking, refusing to quit until help arrived. Loyalty like that can drag a grown man through fear. He pried one crosspiece and slid it aside an inch at a time. The slit widened, revealing the suggestion of a muzzle pressed flat by weight, the line of a closed eye, whiskers clotted with mud. His chest folded in on itself. This was not a simple pickup. This was a life under a pile built by wind and time, held here only because another life would not stop asking. The puppy's bark climbed in pitch. It scrabbled. It stilled when he raised a hand. He mapped the lattice with his fingertips so he would not collapse the wrong section. Sap chilled through the glove leather until his fingers numbed. He levered a heavier limb just high enough to slide a smaller stick free. Each shift drew a tiny gasp that wove itself through the trees and came back thinner. His throat tightened. The lamp trembled. He locked his wrist and pinned it steady. Wind stirred the scent of wet fur and leaf rot with something metallic that tasted like fear. His pulse became a metronome in his neck. The dog ran one more fevered circle and then sat, vibrating, eyes pinned to his hands. "You chose me," he told it, startled by how true that felt. "I'm here." Through the seam, the shape trembled again. He saw dulled nails and a paw curled under in a way that suggested cramp more than break. The whimper broke off. Silence settled so completely he thought for a second he had lost hearing. Then the air moved again inside the lattice, shallow but refusing to stop. He breathed too, sinking without deciding to. Every part of him ached. Shoulders, back, the old line of scar that woke in cold. Yet the ache felt like an argument he could win by not quitting. He rolled another limb, careful as a bomb tech, listening for any snap that would force a new plan. The beam threw long shadows that made hollows look bottomless and solid patches look like holes. Panic would be easy, fatal too. He slowed more because speed here equaled risk. The puppy edged close enough that its flank brushed his knee and stayed, anchor and witness. "Think," he told himself, and also the hidden life. "We'll get you out." His tongue tasted like copper. A stick pricked through a seam and drew a bright sting along his finger. He ignored it and kept clearing. Underbrush shifted beyond the mound. A trick of dark made it seem another animal watched, but Shadow had a habit of volunteering ghosts. He pulled focus back to the truth within reach. A shiver rippled through the tangle. He froze until it passed. The lamp found the faintest gleam where an eye opened a slit. "Good," he said, letting steadiness ride inside the word. The puppy whined in a register he had not heard before, excitement braided with fear. His heart pounded and then set into an unyielding tempo. Behind his hands, another understanding clicked into place. If neglect had made this trap, rescue would not end with extraction. Someone would need to carry, drive, call ahead, pay, wait, and return. The puppy's mission had never been about the company. It had been a summons. He cleared more tangle and accepted that the night now owned his time. The beam widened across the shape, flank, ribs rising shallow, fur laced with burrs. Not a raccoon, not a fox. A dog larger than the guide, body wedged under fallen limbs, still fighting. Michael's breath hitched, then steadied. Whatever story led here was not simple, and it would not be solved by a pat and a meal. The puppy gave one sharp bark and fell silent, as if it too understood that discovery demanded focus. He planted for leverage, slid his hands into the gap, and felt heat under cold life clinging inside weather that wanted to steal it. His shoulders trembled. The beam quivered. He locked his elbow and fixed the light again. The forest leaned closer, branches rustling like whispered counsel, or perhaps his mind needed allies. The shape trembled harder at the next shift. He paused and spoke low, threading assurance into the air. No answer came beyond breath, yet that was an answer enough. He lifted his head and scanned the perimeter because caution survives only when practiced. A faint trail of crushed leaves led away and vanished. Urgency tightened. This place held more story than one tangle. It felt like an accident magnified by the weather until it became a trap. The puppy's loyalty had been right to drag him here, and the stakes climbed with every heartbeat. He set his jaw, chose the next move, and prepared to lift again, fully aware that the night had turned from strange to critical, and that whatever waited under the lattice would decide everything that followed. His hands slid deeper. Bark grated his knuckles. Weight shifted, and the lattice groaned. The hidden dog answered with a broken, breathy cry that cut through him in a clean line. The puppy sprang to the gap, then checked itself, as if understanding that restraint could save more than zeal. Michael exhaled slowly and counted to 3, muscles shaking from cold and strain, mind balancing care against the need to act. The lamp tunneled the dark in a steady cone, silvering every drop on fern and thorn. And in that narrow world he began to move wood not as debris but as puzzle, one piece at a time, until the trembling shape within grew distinct enough to make his heart race with the knowledge that what he had found was a mother holding on by will alone, and that the next breath he guarded might be the last chance to change the night's story. If you have ever chosen to keep going when nothing guaranteed a good outcome, think about the force that moved your foot. Was it fear, pride, faith, or the simple loyalty that binds one life to another when help is needed? Without promise of reward or certainty of success, and ask yourself whether you would follow a trembling guide into darkness because turning back felt like abandoning a duty your heart understood. Michael eased the last branch aside, and truth arrived in a cold, narrow beam, a border collie trapped beneath a crosshatch of limbs, breath rasping as if the night itself pressed on her chest. Her coat, once sleek, had felted into muddy cords. White fur had gone yellow with stain, black patches dulled to charcoal by frost. One eyelid puffed shut, the other lifted enough to show a glassy crescent that searched his face and then faltered. The puppy slid belly low until its nose touched her cheek, released a tremor of sound so thin it almost wasn't there, and then pressed close as if willing warmth through contact. Michael knelt, palm open, letting her read scent, posture, and tone before he touched anything. The mother's ribs rose in choppy ridges, breath snagging and restarting like a tired engine. A pleading intelligence lived in that single visible eye, a question wrapped in pain. Help, can you? He swallowed hard, steadied the light, and mapped the tangle. Branches, vine, weight, angle, leverage. One wrong pull could crush the last air she still found. He set the flashlight to skim rather than glare, tracing contours until the pattern emerged. The puppy pressed into his shin, then returned to its mother, then back again, a metronome of devotion. "I see you," he said, voice tuned to calm. His hands shook anyway. He breathed once, twice, until the tremor left his fingers. Cold bit through glove leather and climbed his wrists. He slid one hand under a crosspiece and tested. It refused. He shifted to the branch that pinned her shoulder. That one gave a reluctant inch, enough to open a slit of air. The mother pulled a longer breath and coughed, a wet, scraping sound that made his throat tighten. The puppy licked at foam on her lip, then lay its head along her jaw, a small mask of comfort. He thought of all the times he had filed reports instead of holding a life like this, and the thought burned. "Stay with me," he said, voice low, steady by force. The mother answered with a flutter at the ribs and a faint, stubborn sound from deep in the throat. He mapped the lattice with careful fingers, feeling for weight, tension, and the place where a single lift would unlock the whole. Every breath she took measured his pace. Every pause threatened to erase the narrow window still open between harm and help. The puppy pressed against her jaw, eyes wide, tiny chest hammering, a sentinel crossed with a child. He levered one limb, slid a shorter stick free, and heard the weak creak of old wood shifting. The collie flinched. A broken whine threaded the dark. "Easy," he murmured, guiding the branch aside. Vine scratched his wrists, drew a line of blood he barely felt. He moved the next piece with the patience of a lockpicker. Each inch widened a slit of air that the dog immediately tried to breathe. The puppy licked her muzzle and then backed off, as if understanding that stillness helped. Michael shifted his knee to brace, felt mud suck, and adjusted. The mother stared at him without blinking, asking for what words cannot carry. "I've got you," he said, uncertain it was true, certain it had to be. Have you ever fought for someone who could not fight alone, even when your body argued to stop? Think of that moment now, the reason you kept lifting when it hurt, and lend it to him here, in this cold, where a fragile life waited on two shaking hands. He spoke into the lattice more than to any listener, shaping belief into sound. "You're not alone. We're almost there." The beam picked up the dull shine of a metal tag matted under tangles, a tiny circle engraved with a star worn almost flat. Whoever had loved her once had done so with care. Neglect had arrived later like weather that never cleared. The thought pricked him, sharp and personal. He lifted another length of branch. It stuck, then rolled with a groan, revealing a shoulder flattened by weight and a foreleg twisted under in a cramp. Her lungs worked like bellows with cracked seams. Foam whisked at the corners of her mouth. Still, when the puppy whimpered, the mother angled her head, seeking, answering as best she could. Love spoke through pain without vocabulary. "Hold on," he said, and set his back, sliding the heavier limb away, hand over hand. Bark grated his knuckles. The lattice slumped, but did not collapse. He wedged a stone under a branch to keep the gap open, then pulled the vine until it snapped, threads stinging. The collie's breaths lengthened by hairs. The puppy leaned in and gave a small rhythmic nudge, reassurance in miniature. Michael's hands shook. He forced the tremor out through a slow exhale and focused on the next move, then the next. The forest attended in taut silence. The final crosspiece pinned her hips. He tested it and felt how one wrong yank could grind bone. He adjusted the light, shifted his weight, and used both hands, palms lifting rather than pulling, letting the branch find a path up instead of sideways. For a second, it refused. He pushed past a flash of panic and gave it steadier pressure. The wood rose, hesitated, and then freed with a brittle sigh. He held it high while his other hand slid under the collie's flank, fingers discovering the churn of ribs and the heat of a body spending its last reserves. "Now," he breathed, and eased her sideways onto clearing ground. The mother rolled, not far, just enough to pull one foreleg free. She gasped, coughed, and pulled air like water after a drought. The puppy squealed and pressed itself against her neck, small body buzzing with relief. Michael checked quickly for deeper wounds. No open gash, no visible twist, only bruising, scrapes, and a dangerous fatigue that makes small mistakes fatal. He took off his jacket, folded it, and slid it under her head. Warmth would matter. So would speed, but not the reckless kind. He cupped her chest and counted the shallow rise, then the next. She looked at him, and the look changed something simple inside him from guard to vow. If he failed now, he would carry that failure into every quiet room he ever entered. "We're going," he said. The puppy answered with a single sharp note, agreement hammered into sound. He anchored his flashlight in a crook, freed both hands, and worked his arms beneath her, testing how much lift she would bear without panic. She tensed, whimpered, and settled when the puppy touched her nose. "Together," he said, and lifted again. She cried out, a thin wire of pain that sliced him clean, but her eye held steady, pleading and brave. He loosened, shifted, tried a narrower angle that spread weight along his forearms, while his knee braced the ground. The move worked. He slid her a hand's breadth, then another. Mud smeared his sleeves. Cold gnawed his fingers. He kept going. The puppy paced beside his boot, matching each motion with a small, quivering step. He paused to breathe, then raised her into the sling he had improvised from his shirt, threading under her chest and tying across his shoulder. The fabric darkened with damp. He cinched his belt around the bundle to limit sway. The collie's head dropped into the crook of his elbow, eye finding her pup again. Something like light moved there, too fragile to name, too strong to deny. "Almost," he said, sweat stinging despite the cold. His forearms burned. His back protested. He leaned her onto the jacket and brushed mud from her whiskers. She panted in shallow ridges, but air now came easier. He scanned again for obvious fractures. Nothing definite, yet anything hidden could bloom on the drive if he mishandled her. He weighed the path back through the trees against minutes lost, calling for another set of hands. The scale inside him settled into motion. Waiting had starved her. Action might reverse the tide. The puppy rested its head on her paw, then looked up at him as if swearing an oath. "All right," he said, and gathered the sling. She was lighter than she looked, yet heavy with consequence. He rose, set his feet, and felt the world narrow to muscle, breath, and the fragile trust draped across his arms. He stepped once, and the puppy fell in beside him, a tiny shadow with a giant mission. His heart raced, hammering not from fear now, but from resolve tempered by grief. The night which had begun as a riddle had become a charge. He would carry it out of these trees if it tore every reserve he had left. He shifted her closer, gave the light a final nudge forward, and began the long walk toward help, mother and pup pressed by devotion into a single, stubborn line of hope. He tightened the knot, felt it hold, and moved. When the belt was seated in the notch and the fabric held, he finally let himself breathe. The woods listened while rescue gathered speed. Michael rose with the border collie bound in his makeshift sling, belt cinched across his shoulder, jacket folded beneath her ribs to cushion pressure, and the flashlight wedged high so the beam could run ahead. The puppy skimmed beside his boot like a living compass, tossing brisk barks that cut the hush into quick strokes of sound. Moonlight sifted through the canopy in thin sheets, painting silver on roots and leaving pockets of dense dark where branches braided. The air had the metallic taste of cold and damp bark. His lungs filled and burned, then steadied as muscle memory took over the gait required by uneven ground. He matched each step to the beam's narrow lane, letting knees absorb the terrain while his hands kept the sling secure. The mother's chest rose in shallow ridges against his forearm, breath stuttering and returning, each fragile cycle commanding him forward. When a pause lingered too long, he froze, counted, felt the faint push resume, and moved again with a silent promise that stopping would belong to regret, not to choice. Roots braided under leaves and tried to hook his toes. Stones rolled when weight landed and skittered out from under him, so he shifted to side steps and short pivots that kept balance honest. The puppy surged ahead, spun back, tapped its pant leg with a quick nose, then pointed its whole body toward the line of trail, voice bright with insistence. He answered by quickening a fraction, careful not to steal breath from the dog cradled against him. He named landmarks to keep focus clear. The wooden footbridge with water chattering under boards, the leaning trunks that formed a rough arch, the shallow gully shaped like a fallen bowl. He had followed these tokens in, and now he reversed them with cargo that could not bear a stumble. Sweat stung where fabric rubbed, cooling as wind threaded the collar. His shoulders throbbed. His grip numbed until he shook, feeling back without jarring the sling. The puppy's barks changed with terrain, short on climbs, spaced on flats, single and sharp when obstacles narrowed. He let that rhythm fix a pace that honored both urgency and caution. The beam found a slick log. He set a boot, tested bite, and cleared, protecting the mother's head with his forearm. Moonlight lifted as clouds thinned, drawing pale lines on the path like chalk notes. A root crown, a stone lip, the edge of a stump polished by weather. He stepped on those signals as if they were rungs on a ladder out of the night. Fear tried to argue that he was late already. Hope argued back through the mother's tiny breaths and the puppy's relentless patrol. If you have ever carried someone fragile through doubt, you know the rule guiding him now. Move smart, not fast, and never stop because fear suggests it. He bent under a low branch and felt heat flare through his back. He breathed through it and rose carefully so the sling would not jar. A gust rattled needles like dry rain. The scent of sap thickened, and then thinned as the trail tilted toward lower ground where frost silvered fern tips. He adjusted the knot and belt when they crept, retied with seconds he hated to spend, and reclaimed those seconds by lengthening his stride where footing allowed. The puppy squeezed through the bramble, then turned and barked twice, meaning hurry without panic. He answered with a nod that the dog could not see and the pace that the dog could feel. The footbridge arrived and flexed under weight. Water below sang in quick syllables. He placed his steps over joists and kept the beam on the far bank, as if light itself towed him. On the other side, the arch of leaning trunks received them like a door swung open to a safer room. Moonlight brightened beyond, etching a lace of shadow across the dirt and showing the faint glitter of gravel near the lot. Relief tried to bloom. He denied it. The work was not done. The mother's lungs still scraped for air, and the puppy's voice still translated urgency. The gully's rim waited ahead, its stones loose as teeth. He edged along, sliding a boot to test purchase, riding small slips instead of fighting them, keeping the beam low so texture stayed honest. When a rock rolled, he went with it, recovered in a crouch, and listened for a change in the dog's breath. A staggered cycle returned, thin but present. He whispered a thanks. He did not try to aim and kept moving. The town's hush began to bleed through the trees, transformer hum, a far train coupling, a stray car over cold pavement. He scanned the darkness for prying eyes and saw only trunks and pale fern leaves. The puppy read the same signals and burst into quicker dashes, checking back each time with a look that pressed belief into him. He told the mother that help stood within reach and that her job was simple. Breathe again and again. She obeyed as if the word had weight. Wind shifted. The beam shivered. He locked his wrist and lifted the bundle higher to change the angle, pressing on her ribs. The sling creaked. Fabric darkened where dew soaked in. Warmth bled from his arms and returned as heat when the climb steepened. His heart hammered in clean, heavy strokes that he used as a metronome. He walked on those beats, taking the hill in diagonals so grade would not steal his legs. Branches scraped his sleeves with the sound of paper tearing. Pine scent gave way to a trace of oil and metal left by cars that had parked here day after day. He pictured the passenger seat and the heater, the dash lights rising, the siren if he needed it, the speed he would demand from the road. He pictured the waiting door at the clinic, hands ready, oxygen, blankets, quiet talk that meant competence, and he allowed that vision to pull like a rope. The puppy leaped a rut, skidded, recovered, and barked a string of sounds that hardened his resolve. He lengthened his stride and paid for it with a flare of pain through his hip. He accepted the toll and kept the gain. Breath stacked high in his chest and refused to deepen until he forced it with a long draw that steadied everything. The beam finally kissed reflective paint on his patrol car's bumper and flared back in a cold splash. He did not celebrate. He closed the distance. Gravel began to grind under his boots, louder than leaves, a coarse sandstorm of sound that sounded like a rival. The puppy sprinted to the door and pawed it, then spun to him and delivered a single command of a bark. He shifted the bundle to free a hand for the handle, careful not to fold the mother's chest, and reached. Deep winter darkness leaned in around him. He met it by setting his jaw, sealing careless thoughts away, and fixing on sequence, door, seat, belt, ignition, path to care. Behind the glass of the beam, the collie pulled another fragile sip of air while the little guide stamped its paws, refusing to let him consider anything except forward. He lifted, felt the bundle settle, and prepared to transfer the weight with the clean economy of someone who understands that seconds matter and that hope can sharpen into action when the loyal insist on it. Michael hauled open the cruiser's rear door, slid the border collie onto a folded jacket, eased the sling so her ribs could rise, then clicked the latch while the puppy vaulted inside and pressed its face to hers, licking in restless bursts as if warmth might travel through touch. He dropped behind the wheel, twisted the key, selected drive, and thumbed the light bar. Red and blue carved the lot. Sirens flowered into the night, a metallic cry that made the trees shiver and the road leap out of shadow. Gravel spat from the tires. Michael gripped the wheel until knuckles blanched, shoulders braced against strain, eyes locked on the narrow lane of headlamps threading between trunks. The collie's breath lifted in uneven ridges. He cracked the heater, angled vents toward the back, and spoke in a low tone that steadied him as much as it soothed them. Cold air bled from his jacket sleeves. Sweat ran under his collar. The night smelled of sap, wet fur, and fear trying to turn into resolve. The path gave way to asphalt. He floored it, then feathered, mind running ahead to lights, doors, hands, oxygen, a table bright enough to replace the moon with certainty. Sirens curled over the hills and scattered the quiet like starlings. The needle climbed. Signs flashed by, trailhead, feed store, diner asleep under neon embers. Every landmark felt like a rung on a ladder hauled from darkness. In back, the puppy scrabbled, licked, pawed, then planted its forelegs alongside the mother's jaw and held there, vibrating, a guard with a child's heart. Michael checked the mirror every few seconds without letting the road blur. Lines hissed under the tires. He told dispatch his route, condition unknown, ETA 7. Static crackled, then cleared with a clipped acknowledgement. Wind hammered the roof. Street lamps appeared ahead like candles banking in a vigil. The small town's edge gave up to wider lanes, warehouse walls, chain link singing in the slipstream, billboards washed in coolant blue. He rode the median to pass a slow truck that drifted right at the wail of sirens. The puppy answered with a quick yip as if agreeing to the urgency. The collie's chest lifted, stalled, lifted again. "Stay with me," he said, voice tight, and the words sounded like a promise made to 3 hearts at once. He pushed the heater hotter, cracked the rear windows a finger's width to keep air fresh, and steadied the car through an intersection that coughed up one late sedan. Brake lights flared. Space opened. He slid through with inches to spare. The hospital's direction sign blinked past. He pictured the awning, the glass doors, the bell, the stainless tray, the masked faces leaning in. Fear tried to drag breath short. Hope answered with images of blankets, fluids, and a machine that could smooth a ragged rhythm into something survivable. He leaned forward, elbows locked, forearms taut, wrists loose enough to correct micro-sways. Time stretched and bunched. A light slashed the cabin, then vanished. The puppy's tongue never stopped. It paced again, then curled for 3 beats before springing up to touch its mother's nose with a tiny, pleading sound that broke and reformed like a thin wave. Michael blew air through his teeth, smoothed his tone, and said the name he had not yet chosen, trying syllables as if a word might anchor life to life. Traffic thickened near the town center. He cut left around a bus that lumbered off schedule, sirens driving a corridor through errands, worries, and late dinners. He threaded between cars, hit a green that felt bestowed, and surged toward a final bend where sodium lights painted the road a tired gold. The sign for North County Veterinary shimmered in the distance like a lighthouse seen from a storming deck. The puppy placed both paws on the seat edge, still licking, small body trembling with a strength that looked like devotion weaponized. The mother's eyes opened a slit, then drifted, then tried again. "Good girl," he said, hardly hearing himself. Warm light met cold night. A bell stung the foyer. A tech at the desk looked up, saw the bundle, and vaulted the counter with a shout for a gurney. Michael slid his arms under the collie as the puppy hopped down and trotted alongside, still reaching to touch muzzle to cheek. 2 more staff appeared, hands ready, questions already forming. "Hit by a car?" "Trapped under branches," he answered, breath chopping into short pieces. Gloves, blankets, an oxygen mask, tape snapping free, metal clatter, wheels squeaking, doors swinging, motion took command. They rolled the mother toward treatment, eyes sympathetic yet focused. The puppy trotted beside until a nurse swept it up and tucked it against a warm chest while jogging. Michael followed, then halted at the doorway marked "Staff Only" as the team vanished behind a closing seam of white. Silence swelled, then broke under the waiting room's softer sounds. A humming vending machine, an aquarium in muted blues, a clock grinding minutes like stones. The siren's echo faded from his bones and left a heavy tremor. "Sit," someone said kindly. He did. Hands knotted, jaw tight enough to ache. He watched the puppy pace a figure 8 across the tile, climb his thigh, press paws against his chest, then slide down to race toward the closed door again. Each time it reached that threshold, it looked back with a question he could not answer. He stroked its head, counted breaths that were not his, and tried not to borrow outcomes. The room smelled of disinfectant, paper, and faint coffee. A poster on the far wall listed emergency signs in block letters. Another displayed smiling adoptees. He kept failing to focus on either. Memories tried to crawl in, cases closed, calls that ended without a disaster, nights when routine never bent, but none fit this particular ache. Dispatch pinged. He texted a brief update, then turned the phone face down as if hiding it could slow time. The nurse returned briefly to say they had established an airway, that the temperature was low, hydration poorer, and that they were working. She did not offer guarantees. He thanked her, voice hoarse. The puppy drank from a paper bowl, then returned to its post at his boot and lay its chin on his laces, eyes on the seam between doors as if willpower could pry it open. Minutes lengthened into a rope he wanted to pull hand over hand. Outside, ambulance colors feathered through the glass as another unit cut across the lot. Somewhere, a radio mumbled about an unrelated call. The sound floated and popped like static on an old record. He realized he still clenched the ghost of the wheel. He opened his fingers, flexed, then pressed palms against his knees to stop the shake. The puppy climbed onto his lap again, heart beating a furious rhythm against his stomach. He whispered thanks, apologies, vows, anything that felt like language might matter. Hope remained, thin as a filament yet refusing to snap. Fear stayed too, heavier, stubborn, wearing a face shaped like loss. He let both sit without pretending to choose. A door swung. The tech crossed with a tray, eyes intent, then disappeared again. The clock ticked forward, and he found himself matching breath to its pace, then rejecting that mechanical cadence for the slower one in the hall beyond, where living lungs might be learning a safer tempo. He imagined the table, the mask, the IV line, the deliberate hands, the whispered instructions traveling across mouths like spells. He imagined failure, stopped, then stood because sitting felt like surrender. The puppy stood with him. They faced the shut door as if posture itself could influence outcomes. A gust rattled the awning outside and set the bell to a mild shiver. Tires hissed on wet pavement and faded. Night thinned beyond the windows. False dawn from parking lot lamps made the world look almost gentle. Michael held the small dog and waited inside a balance point where one nudge could tip everything either way, and where hope, though quiet, still asked for the patience to see what the next minute would allow. Still, he waited. The waiting room felt too clean for midnight. Fluorescent panels humming above tiles that mirrored motion in pale rectangles, chairs lined in a grid no one wanted to disturb. Michael sat with the puppy tucked beneath his coat, heat pooling between fabric and fur, both of them damp, both running on the thin current that follows shock and refuses to quit. A vending machine murmured against the wall. An aquarium bathed a rack of brochures in drifting blue. A clock clicked forward with a patience that cut. The nurse had taken the border collie through swinging doors with a small convoy of blankets, oxygen and steady hands, and then the seam closed and left him with air that smelled of disinfectant. Paper cups, old coffee, and the ghost of rain carried in on shoes. The puppy wriggled, then stilled, muzzle peeking from his collar, eyes fixed on the door marked "Staff Only" with the intensity of a watchman. He rubbed behind its ear, feeling the tiny tremor that ran through it every time a tray rattled or a wheel squeaked somewhere beyond the bright seam. He replayed the route from the woods, every ditch, root, and shadow folded into a long ribbon that now lay behind them. And whenever doubt tried to cut in, too late, too much damage, not enough time. He replaced it with the small insistence of breath he had counted against his forearm while carrying her. The chair took his weight unevenly. A spring pressed an old bruise. None of it mattered. He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees, coat draped over both of them like a tent, while the puppy breathed fast against his wrist and then tried for slower, as if borrowing his rhythm. He whispered steady words he did not fully believe yet, not promises, only presence. An overnight receptionist walked past with a stagger of charts, nodded without breaking stride, and disappeared behind a station lamp that made a cone of gold on a stack of forms. The aquarium bubbled. A poster on the far wall listed emergency signs in cheerful font. He tried to read a line and failed, moved to the next, failed again, then gave up and watched the door. The puppy slipped down to the floor, executed 2 tight circles, climbed up his shin, and parked on his thigh like a small sentry with duties too large. When a cart rattled somewhere beyond the threshold, it lifted its head and whispered a sound that was not quite a bark, then collapsed into silence as if conserving what it had left. He cupped it with both hands and felt the minute thud of a heart doing overtime for 2. Have you ever waited under a hard light and held on to a fragile possibility because the alternative felt unbearable? 1 hour, 1 call, 1 door away from an answer you could not shape? Think of that moment and the way hope glowed even when numbers, odds, or voices around you urged caution. That filament is what he held now, not loud, not naive, only real enough to warm a small circle against a cold room. He did not pray aloud, but the words inside him sounded like gratitude and bargaining braided together. A tech cracked the door, asked for the puppy by a soft nickname that rose and vanished before he could catch it, then handed him a paper cup of water and a towel warmed in a dryer. He wiped mud from the small paws and the crescent notch in one ear, then used the towel's last heat to take chill from his own hands before pressing them around the pup again. The dog exhaled and tucked its face into his palm, a small surrender that felt like trust stitched to exhaustion. Footsteps echoed along the hall, then hushed. A monitor beeped somewhere beyond the bright seam, once, then again, regular as train wheels. He managed to take 3 slow breaths in a row and hold them long enough to soften the thrum running under his skin. When the nurse returned, she spoke with the practiced calm of someone who lives between fear and procedure. Temperature low, hydration poor, No obvious fractures, possible internal stress, oxygen helping, fluids started, numbers unstable but responsive. Critical, she said carefully. Possible, she added carefully. He nodded once because anything more would shatter the composure he had built from thin parts. Relief loosened something he had cinched tight without noticing, yet it did not spill into joy. It settled like a small weight that kept him from floating into dread. He thanked her, found his voice raw, and watched her go back through the door as if the word itself should have been heavier and more useful. The puppy stood on his knee and licked his chin, then stretched toward the vanishing seam, body a line of intent. He gathered it in one arm and felt how the tremble had shifted from fear to a restless waiting that mirrored his own. He told it what the nurse had said, soft and even, and the act of shaping facts into tone steadied him more than the content. He remembered the metal tag matted under the collie's coat, the faint star engraved on it. And he imagined a porch on a different night, a hand threading a collar with affection so ordinary it went unremarked. The thought threatened to knock him sideways. He held his ground by counting the seconds between sounds in the hall and then counting the length of the puppy's breaths until the two patterns met in the middle. Minutes walked by wearing ordinary shoes. He texted dispatch that he would be offline until released, that a report would follow, and that the situation remained open. The reply came back with a single word that meant understanding. He put the phone on silent and slid it face down because noise now felt like interference with a fragile frequency. The puppy completed another tight figure 8, scaled his lap, and curled under his coat with its spine pressed along his stomach. A small bar of warmth that asked for nothing except endurance. He rested his hand on its side and felt the rise and fall begin to steady, then matched his own breathing to that measure until both bodies settled into a truce with waiting. The receptionist replaced the coffee pot and left the old half-cup steaming faintly on a side table for anyone who needed it. He did not move to take it, afraid that leaving the chair would let some unseen lever drop. He pictured the room beyond the door as a topography of light. Table, tubing, masks, needles, steady faces, the border collie's chest moving under a plastic dome, the slow miracle of a number rising one notch and then holding. He allowed that picture to exist without editing, then let it drift like a lantern set on water. The puppy's paws twitched as if running in a dream. He traced a finger along the nicked ear and felt the tiny dog release a sigh that belonged to shared fatigue. A new set of steps approached, firmer, the cadence of someone carrying news and calibrating delivery. The vet entered, a woman with kind eyes framed by the shadow of a night that had not offered much sleep. She sat rather than stood, hands open, posture honest. Critical, she repeated, eyes steady. Still a chance, she said, and the words carried weight, expertise, and the stern boundary of truth. Oxygen had eased the worst struggle. Fluids were building a base. Pain control took hold. A cardiac irregularity demanded caution. Temperature required gradual correction. She would not predict. She would not discard hope. He took it like a ration that could carry them to dawn. Thank you, he said, and the gratitude came out clearer than he expected. The vet reached to scratch the puppy's head, smiled when it leaned into her hand, and promised updates at intervals that felt both near and distant. When she left, the room recovered its hum, but the air had shifted by a degree, no longer heavy with the sense of a shut door. He held the small dog and stared at the seam again, feeling relief tamped by restraint, aware that anything louder would betray the work still underway. The puppy curled closer, wedging its muzzle into the crook of his elbow, spine pressed to his ribs, a fit so snug it felt designed. Their bond, born in running and fear, settled into something calmer and stronger under the harsh lights, a promise without ceremony, the kind that simply decides to continue. He did not let himself imagine years, routines, names on bowls, familiar routes, or kitchen floors warmed by morning sun. He kept his mind here, in this sterile room where loyalty and skill labored together, while a small life tried to climb back toward safety. The clock advanced another notch. He breathed with it. The puppy dreamed against him and woke, eyes bright, then lowered its head onto his wrist and let waiting become the work. Morning washed the clinic lobby in thin gold when Michael returned, jacket zipped, coffee cooling, the puppy at his heel like a drumbeat. A tech waved them into an observation room where soft beeps stitched time into order. Beneath a warming blanket, the border collie lay under an oxygen dome that fogged and cleared. Her chest rose in steadier arcs than the night before. The puppy tapped its claws on the tile, pressed its nose to the plastic, and let out a hopeful murmur. Michael whispered hello, and the mother's eye flickered, not bright yet, but there. He kept his voice even, naming small things, sun on snow, warm hands, quiet rooms, until the rhythm of the machines steadied his own breath and the puppy's restless tremor eased into watchfulness. Progress arrived in inches. A tube retired, replaced by a gentle line. Temperature nudged upward. Fluids rebuilt what cold had drained. Someone wrote figures on a whiteboard like small flags. Rhythm steadier, oxygen higher, appetite possible. The puppy refused distance beyond a step, shrinking and stretching with tireless devotion. Michael learned the new grammar of care. Hold a bowl without jostling, stroke a paw without crowding, speak in promises your tone can keep. When shoes squeaked behind the door, the puppy looked up. When silence returned, it pressed closer to the cot, as if glue had a heartbeat. Day 2 felt like sunrise. The collie lifted her head for 3 beats and tried to lick his wrist through the plastic. The puppy yipped, showered her cheek with kisses, then settled again, tail sweeping tile in soft arcs. Michael brought a blanket from home, folded it under the cot so familiar scent could anchor rest, and left a note on the board. Keep going. Staff teased him about moving in. He answered with coffee runs and neat questions. When a brief fever rattled gains, he paced the hall until a nurse leaned out and said, "Still with us," and the words landed like warm stones inside cold water. Midweek, the dome rolled to a corner. A pale bandage hugged fragile ribs. She drank from a shallow dish, paused, drank again, and slept like sleep had finally remembered her name. The puppy positioned itself under the cot like a guard with short legs and a long mission. Michael read care sheets twice, asked what pain looks like when pride hides it, and learned to hear the difference between discomfort and simple weariness. He counted breaths in sets of 10, reached 30, reached 40, and let himself smile without letting hope run ahead of evidence. Small mercies stacked up. Longer drinks, brighter eyes. A tail thumping twice before sleep reclaimed it. One afternoon, she licked Michael's wrist with deliberate care and left her head in his palm as if fitting a key to a long-locked door. The puppy spun triumphant circles, slid, popped up, and resumed its parade. Laughter startled him. It had been a while. He bought 2 bowls, a gentle brush, a crate he intended to keep open, and collars etched with names that arrived on their own. Scout for the mother, Patch for the pup. He set the tags down and watched them catch light like coins on shallow water. By week's end, discharge shifted from if to when. Instructions multiplied. Medications, bandage changes, range of motion, checkups, warning signs, numbers to call at any hour. Michael repeated each step until the nurse nodded. He signed with a hand that wanted to shake and refused. Paper finished, he clipped the new collar around Scout's neck and kissed the notch on Patch's ear. They left beneath a sky polished to silver. Scout rode on blankets with a harness that allowed rest without strain. Patch took the middle and laid one paw gently on her shoulder as if keeping time with breath. Life rebuilt itself around shared needs. Morning began with gentle meds, warm water, and slow stretches by the window where light pooled. Afternoons meant brief walks to a clean strip of grass, applause from neighbors, and tiny treats that tasted like permission to hope. Michael learned to rap without pressure, adjust bowl height to spare sore ribs, and nap on the floor when settling required company. On Sunday, numbers held and weight nudged upward. The vet scratched Patch and told Scout she was stubborn in the best way. The answers steadied him and gave shape to the road ahead. Rain stitched silver lines across the window that night. Michael made soup, halved a sandwich, and ate on the floor while Scout watched with amused patience, and Patch pretended indifference badly. He mapped future outings for when clearance allowed. The river path, a bakery that shares crumbs, a park where geese scold everybody. He spoke until the apartment felt larger. When they settled, Patch tucked along Scout's side, and Scout lifted her head to nose his knuckles, a quiet blessing that rewrote the worst hour of that cold night. Days kept building. Joy threaded routine like bright floss through denim, subtle yet strong. Scout learned to stand without the sling, then to circle 2 rooms without stopping. Patch learned patience in tidy 5-minute stretches and celebrated each gain with a bark that sounded like weather turning. Michael changed too. Laughter came easier. Sleep deepened. Silence felt like peace instead of distance. He added a mat by the door, a water bowl in the kitchen, and a hook for leashes on the wall. He stopped avoiding the mirror at dawn and started greeting the person in it. One evening, twilight washed the living room with copper quiet, like the night everything began. Scout rested on the rug, eyes bright, breath even. Patch brought a tennis ball and dropped it on Michael's boot, then looked between them as if proposing terms. He rolled it gently. Scout trapped the felt with one paw and pushed it back. Patch squealed. The simplest game became a ceremony. Later, under stars, he clipped leashes and stepped into crisp air. Frost glittered on the grass. A train sang a low iron lullaby. Scout leaned into his leg while Patch patrolled a brave circle. Michael thought of branches pinning a life, sirens cutting stillness, the knot in his chest when breath paused too long, and the minute a trembling guide pulled him past doubt. That night had broken routine and built a family. If you have ever stood inside uncertainty and chosen hope anyway, share this story so someone else remembers courage when their moment arrives. Subscribe if you want more rescues and quiet victories. Support local shelters with time, supplies, or a small gift that turns into blankets, medicine, and hands. Compassion multiplies when shared. A click can carry farther than you think. Weeks later, sunlight found the window again. Scout climbed onto the rug unassisted and settled with slow dignity. Patch leapt onto the couch and immediately sat, remembering new rules, then slid down and curled at her side. Michael clipped both collars and whispered, "Ready." They followed him to the door, tails marking an easy drumbeat. Love and loyalty needed no speeches. They proved themselves in quiet rooms, cold woods, late drives, warm hands. 3 lives had met at the edge of fear and walked back together. That is the miracle worth passing on, so pass it on.